Welcome to the Southeastern 14 podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Today, special guest, Drew DeArmond. He is on ESPN 97.7. The Zone in Huntsville. Has been a good friend of mine for a few years. I have done his show a few times, and now he's returning the favor, and I'm pretty excited about that. Drew, welcome to the show. It's just a crazy time in the state of Alabama, and really a particularly crazy day today.
Well, Chris, it's an honor to be with you. I appreciate the time on your podcast. And, yeah, it's really been a crazy last 24 hours in Auburn. There's been a lot of rumors going around about Bryan Harsin. Really, everything started to come off the rails. I mean, there was concern about players leaving and transferring, but that happens whenever you have a transition to a head coach, a new staff. And I'm talking about when you first get there and even after the first season. But I think the biggest concern was the coaches. Derek Mason going to Oklahoma State, I think, was a huge red flag. And then the Austin Davis situation. They brought him in from the Seattle Seahawks to be quarterback coach, offensive coordinator. Now, it was never, revealed if he was going to call plays or not. A lot of people were thinking Bryan Harsin would take over play calling. But, he left after Austin Davis after a month. And then is not taking another job and staying in the NFL. He's just taking a sabbatical from football. And the inside word seems to be that, after a month on the job and a couple of weeks on the road, I don't think college football was for him. I don't think the recruiting grind was. I think he felt like he was going to have to spend way too much time away from his family. In the NFL, as you know, and you're in Nashville, the Tennessee Titans, you cover them, you've been around it enough, it's a totally different deal. You've got a lot of downtime after the season. You just got OTAs. You don't have to recruit. And in recruiting, as you know, in any sport in collegiate athletics, it's 24 hours, almost 24 hours, it seems like, 365 days a year. You have to recruit all the time. And I think Austin Davis realized that wasn't for him. He's still young in his coaching career, so he took a step away, and I think that was very alarming to some Auburn people. And I'll say this too. None of this would have mattered, and this is just the way it is in the state of Alabama. If Auburn had finished the drill, if Tank Bigsby had not run out of bounds, if they had beaten Alabama in the Iron Bowl 10-3, I think they would have turned around and won the bowl game. Probably wouldn't have even had to go to the Birmingham Bowl. They would have gone to a better bowl. If they had done all that, they'd won the bowl and beaten Alabama and finished their season instead of 6-7, 8-5. We're not even having this conversation because the most important thing at Auburn, still for Auburn football, is to beat Alabama. You want to have a championship program. You want to win the SEC. You want to win a national title. But the thing first and foremost you have to do is beat Alabama. That's why Gus Malzahn, who after his remarkable 2013 first season really was mediocre for much of the rest of his tenure, Chris, because even the 2017 season when Auburn made their last run toward the college football playoff, they fell flat at the end. They lost to Georgia in the SEC title game decisively. They lost the bowl game to UCF. He really was a 3 or 4 loss, 5 loss coach the rest of his career after that first season. But he stayed around because he beat Nick Saban 3 times. He's the only coach to do it. That's the most important thing at Auburn. And so I think they were really disturbed also when they didn't sign anyone this past Wednesday. And so on signing day, they went 0 for 4. They were very concerned about the recruiting. This 2023 class in state in Alabama, I've been following this closely, Chris, since I was a kid in the late 80s. It's the most talented class probably in the state's history. And Auburn is losing a ton of momentum with a lot of them. And they're not considered a favorite for many, if any. So I think they were very concerned with all those factors. There's been some rumors about his personal life, which I'm not even going to put any substance to because, again, that's a very dangerous thing. But I will say this. It seems to me that it's a very toxic situation down there. And if you're Bryan Harsin, I know he just did an interview with Chris Lowe of ESPN, who I have so much respect for Chris. He's such a classy guy, great reporter. I think Bryan Harsin's digging in here hard, and I think Auburn is going to have to pay him to leave. And I think it's going to really hurt this Auburn program anyway, because I personally believe, I know that the environment's changed with the SEC network, with the millions of dollars that you put into these programs. I think you should at least get what Chad Morris got, 2 years to prove yourself. And if by the second year you have back-to-back losing seasons, okay, Auburn, you can cut the cord. I think it's a mistake to treat Bryan Harsin the way they're treating him now, and it looks like they're going to force him out unless something changes. And to me, that may set Auburn football back a couple of years, because when you're having to transition to a new staff, especially when you're having to hire someone right before spring practice, everybody's been hired already. Who are you going to go get that's going to be an upgrade? And this just reeks of Kevin Steele, because, as you know, if you followed the search, a year ago, there was a lot of power brokers at Auburn that wanted Kevin Steele to be elevated from defensive coordinator to head coach, and he's out there. He just took 2 jobs. He was at Maryland for a week under Mike Lockley. Now he's under Mario Cristobal at Miami. But he would be the only answer for me right now for Auburn to hire right now, because why would you go down there in an environment like that when you're not being given a fair shake? And your athletic director is on the last year of his contract, Alan Green, and is likely out the door too. So a lot of instability at Auburn. The only thing they've got going for them right now is they've got an outstanding basketball coach in Bruce Pearl, #1 team in the country, a great baseball coach in Butch Thompson. But right now, football-wise, it's not a good situation on the Plains.
Drew, we could literally do a 3 or 4 hour podcast on this today, which we won't. But I look at this from the outside, and I don't know the truth. I don't know how many people know the truth, but some of it's perception, first of all, when it comes to player treatment. But that's one layer of it, because you've seen some players come out and say, he's my coach, he's great. Some others had a different take, and the transfer portal certainly has not hurt him or has not helped Bryan Harsin in terms of perception. That's one layer. The other layer you briefly mentioned in passing, it's the one that set Twitter ablaze today. We're not going to go there. And the other layer is just relationships and fit, which was a question from the beginning, right? Because he came from Idaho. I don't think there were really any SEC ties there. I think we talked off podcast. The president may have made that selection for reasons, that relate to the job and dealing with the booster base, for lack of a better way to put it. But it just seems like you've got power brokers there that don't want him there, and that's probably the third layer of it too. Is that all? Is there anything more? Is it just really the player thing, the portal, the recruiting, and the booster relationships? And again, the other thing we won't get into, or is there something else that's in play here too? And one more thing I will say with regards to what you said earlier about if he had success, he'd still be there. Look, when you're 11-1, they call it players can't take tough coaching. When you're 6-7, it's abuse, right? Maybe that's not nuanced enough, but it's funny how this works, because I think it does come back to wins and losses in a lot of ways. And if you win, your problems kind of go away, and if not, they get magnified in an attempt to run you out of there.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, no doubt, is the players feel empowered now. The NIL situation. If you're not winning, it goes back to what you said. Because really, if you forget, it seems like so many moons ago, this Auburn team was 6-2 and ranked 12th in the country. I don't think any of these players would have been complaining about Bryan Harsin.
Right.
But they lost 5 in a row. And when you lose, there's going to be people complaining. There's going to be players questioning things. I just think he had a mess to clean up, because the recruiting had slipped under Gus Malzahn. He totally changed everything offensively and defensively that they had been doing when he got there. So people forget. Nick Saban went 7-6 in year one in Tuscaloosa. Okay, And if they did not win the Weed Eater Bowl or / whatever it was at that point in time in Shreveport against Colorado and Dan Hawkins, they wouldn't have had a winning record, because that Alabama team was 6-2 and lost 4 to end the season, including to Louisiana Monroe. I was at that game. I'll never forget it. So these things happen in the first year. That's what bothers me. You can't, it's not a quick fix. What Gus Malzahn did is an outlier when he took over in 2013 and nearly won a national championship. So there were some things to fix. I think the program had gotten soft. I think Bryan Harsin had to instill some more discipline in it. I think, I was just reading some quotes from Colby Wooten, who is a prominent defensive player on the Auburn football team, and that's basically what he's saying in defense of Bryan Harsin. He's like, there doesn't need to be any more babysitting in this program, no more BS. He goes, we had gotten soft. And so that's what I'm saying. There are some issues there that need to be fixed. And I think sometimes if you fire a head football coach in 1 year, if you're basically telling the guy, okay, if you don't beat Alabama in year one, or if you don't go 8-4 in year one, you're gone, you're sending the wrong message. You're not going to be able to, hire an elite football coach to get your program where it needs to be. And in this NIL era now, Auburn has lost a lot of traction. When you think about Alabama and the way they're recruiting and coming off back-to-back national championship game appearances, you think of Texas A&M, who just signed arguably the greatest recruiting class ever on paper, and they lost 4 games last year. And then LSU under Brian Kelly. I'm not the biggest Brian Kelly guy from the standpoint of at Notre Dame. I thought he was solid. I never thought that he had a team that could win a national championship. Now, with the resources and the less academic restrictions at LSU, maybe he can do that. And he's getting paid a lot of money, like Nick Saban money, to do it. But you got Brian Kelly in place. He's he's certainly going to improve what has happened the last 2 years at LSU under Ed Ogeron. He will be much more organized. He does know how to run a program. So that's another quality coach, at least, within the SEC West. You got Mike Leach, who is so unorthodox, but he's another guy that could be a pain in the rear end. Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss Rebels finished second in the West. And so really, if you're Auburn, you're teetering right here. Now, I think in their power brokers' minds, they want to cut bait and go in a different direction, because they don't think Harsin will ever solve the issues. But to me, until you give a guy at least 2 years to put his systems in, to recruit his guys, I think it's a huge mistake. And I think it could really hurt Auburn from a perception standpoint from the outside for a great coach to come in there and want to do something. Alabama went through the same thing, okay? When Coach Bryant retired and then Coach Perkins left for the Buccaneers, they kind of went through the abyss for a while. They hired Bill Curry, who was a bad fit, and then they had to bring in a Gene Stallings, who was a much better fit at Alabama. Then when Coach Stallings abruptly retired, they made a mistake by hiring Mike DeBose, pardon me. And then Franchione came in. He was really the first outside-the-box hire, did a great job, but really wasn't cut out to stay there because he didn't fit. And then you have the Mike Shula situation. But that's when Alabama finally fully realized, look, okay, we've tried the Alabama alum deal. It hasn't worked. Or the former Alabama assistant coach. We have to go hire the best coach in the country. They did that with Nick Saban, and they got out of his way. The same thing needs to happen at Auburn, but the problem is, if you go back and look at the history of Auburn football, all the way back to Coach Jordan, and then they were able to hire Pat Dye. But even Pat Dye was a guy, even though he was a Georgia guy, he understood Auburn, and he understood the SEC. I think the mistake that was made with Bryan Harsin, even though during this conversation I've said he deserves a second year, and I still believe that, I think that what happened is Alan Green, who's likely on his way out, won a power struggle with the boosters, but they hired a coach with no ties to the South. I mean, at least Nick Saban had been at LSU, so he had some familiarity with the SEC. Bryan Harsin was all the way out at Boise State. The closest he had ever been was Arkansas State, and I'm not sure he truly understood Auburn or truly understood the SEC. And he's come in there, and to his credit, he is trying to hardline things and do it his way. But what you just mentioned with the Auburn boosters and the power brokers and the Jimmy Raines of the world, they're going to bristle at that kind of thing. So the one thing you got to do is win and win quickly. He hasn't done that, and now they seem to be looking for anything and everything to fire him for cause. But it's a toxic situation. It's a sad situation, and I think it's going to hurt Auburn football. I think what they need is for people to finally all row the boat in the same direction, go hire the best football coach possible. And I don't know that it was Bryan Harsin when they searched, but they need to hire the best guy possible and get out of his way. But the problem is, at Auburn, it's always been kind of a guy that they wanted that was somewhat connected to the school in some way, or to Coach Dye because of the success he had. Just like with Gus Malzahn and Gene Chizik, they were both connected to Auburn as coordinators before they got the head coaching job. Bryan Harsin was not, and this just seems like a bad fit from the jump, and it doesn't look like it's going to have a conclusion that's going to be beneficial for Bryan Harsin or for Auburn football, except for Bryan Harsin's bank account. Bryan Harsin will make a lot of money, but he's going to have to probably restart his career as a head coach elsewhere, because I can tell you, Chris, Dennis Franchione knew he was a bad fit at Alabama. He almost left for Kansas after year one many years ago.
Wow.
Bryan Harsin pursued a couple of jobs, whether it be Oregon or Washington behind the scenes. He wanted to go back to the West Coast after this year at Auburn because he knew he didn't fit, but he wasn't able to find a landing spot. And now we're seeing what's happening as he's digging in, Auburn's digging in, and it looks like it's going to be a messy divorce.
Yeah, I went to bed early last night. I wake up, I get a couple of text messages about Bryan Harsin. I'm like, what's going on? You know, you check the internet and you're like, whoa. And the thing that hit me immediately is like, again, hard to know what's true and what's not. And two people can be in the same room and watch the same thing and come up with very different conclusions. So I'm not taking a side on it one way or the other. But I looked at it and I said, somebody wants him out of there badly with some of the things that are circulating. And I don't know, everybody's different, but to me, I'm with you. You find a way for a divorce. I thought what he did with Chris Lowe and ESPN was very smart in terms of PR. But if I'm him, I'm just like, I'm not a big like to hang around places where I'm not wanted kind of guy. I just think it makes for a toxic thing. There's so much out of your control, and I just think they have to wrap this up and move on. I know that's kind of what you just said, but I looked at what was out there this morning, and I just thought, holy cow! I mean, that you can't stick around that.
You really can't. And here's going to be some of the collateral damage. I still think if you dismiss him, you probably are going to lose Tank Bigsby. He's probably going to go back into the portal and go elsewhere. I mean, the new coach, if it were a Kevin Steele who helped recruit him, maybe he could, keep the kid in the program. But I still think they're going to have some guys leave. I don't see how you have a good football team next year. And I think, one of the things that bothered some of the Auburn fans and really probably the power brokers, I know he didn't have the kind of career people were hoping, but he still played at a pretty high level. I think when Harsin couldn't keep a guy like Bo Nix in the program, and he's a legacy guy who his father played at Auburn, his mother's an alum, I think that really rubbed them the wrong way. He decides he wants to go to Oregon across the country to finish his college football career. He got a degree from Auburn, but he had another year of eligibility. And so I think that really bothered the Auburn people because, again, they're very proud of their heritage. They're very proud to have alums on the team. Shedrick Jackson is Bo Jackson's nephew, who's a wide receiver who came back. So I think they were really kind of caught off guard by that, okay. But again, I'll say it again. If TJ Finley had beaten Alabama, none of it would have mattered. And I'm just telling you, the importance of that rivalry, of having the upper hand on Alabama, is so important to Auburn. And I think they would have given Bryan Harsin more leeway. But when a lot of this stuff went south down the stretch, when they had a 5-game losing streak, and when the recruiting was average, because I think they finished about 8th in the SEC in recruiting, even though they're in the top 20 in the country. Because again, we talk about how much talent comes into the league. And then you look at guys like Billy Napier looks like a home run to me at Florida.
Yes,
I think that was a really good hire. I think he's going to be a pain in the rear end to Kirby Smart, even though Kirby now has gotten over the hump. And Kirby just bought himself 10 to 15 years of equity at Georgia just by winning a national championship. Just like Coach Dooley, that's the cherry on top of his career at Georgia. This will be that for Kirby. I mean, I know he's only in year 6 and he's still a relatively young head coach, but he bought himself a ton of time. And so I think, to tell you how this league is going, Kentucky and Missouri were in the top 12 in the country in recruiting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's where, and Auburn's not even there. So Auburn is losing a lot of momentum. Their basketball program, it's so crazy. It's like we're in the twilight zone.
Yes, it is.
Auburn basketball is number 1 in America, arguably the best program in the country right now with that pipeline to Atlanta. And Auburn football is just looking like they're in free fall. It's really weird, and it's going to be interesting to see how the powers that be. First of all, if they're going to have to figure out their long-term solution. They just hired their new school president, who'd been on the faculty for 28 years. But they're going to have to figure out who their AD is long-term and then their football coach. So, maybe they even go with an interim coach in this situation for this season if they dismiss Harsin. But the only problem with that is when you look at that staff, the way he was restructuring it, a lot of it was Boise State guys. Eric Kiesau, they have ended up being elevated to from wide receivers coach to offensive coordinator. There's not really a guy you look at and be like, okay, he could be the interim coach. They just hired Christian Robinson, who was Florida's interim head coach, and, he just got there. So he doesn't really even know the personnel. I mean, the timing of this is just really bad. So I'm going to be interested to see, if Harsin can fight and keep his job, or if, again, if they just decide to blow it up and start over. But again, if I'm Bryan Harsin, I'm digging in. And if they're going to dismiss me after 1 year, I am getting every penny of that $18 million buyout because, to me, it's just very, very fishy about firing for cause. We talked about some of the off-the-field situations. You'd have to have a lot of proof in that deal. And that just, to me, that could be a messy situation that could be a total distraction to your football program. So I just think right now Auburn football is in a bad place. We'll see what they can do. But they better thank the Lord for Bruce Pearl because right now Auburn football is, I think, if you had to ask me, if you rank the programs 1 through 7 or whatnot in the SEC West, they're going to be at the bottom of the pile right now because they got a bad fit at head coach. The recruiting doesn't look great. And then to top it all off, you've got Alabama in your state with Nick Saban looking like he's nowhere near done.
There's so much meat on the bone here, but and every time you say something, about 14 things pop into my head. But let me just start here. How much do they pay or are still paying Gus Malzahn? Because they went through this a year ago.
Yeah, they're in the midst of paying him $20 million.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. So and think about that. That's an astronomical sum. And you're talking about paying his successor in a year $18 million because you guaranteed 70% of the money because he was on a 5-year guaranteed contract. So there's going to have to be some boosters and donors really pony up some money if they want to get rid of Bryan Harsin.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so to me, I've never and trust me, I've been covering Alabama a long time, following Alabama a long time. Alabama, Mike Price never coached a game, but what he did played out in the public eye, and he got himself into some public situations with some alcoholism and some and just not and being under the influence of alcohol and things of that nature. That just really he was his own worst enemy, and he really. It was his own fault that happened and that he was dismissed. This situation reeks of, we don't like the coach. We don't like 4 or 5 things he's done. He, hasn't played the game the way we like it. And so we want to, dismiss him, and we want to dismiss the athletic director. because they haven't talked about that, but you and I just talked early in the conversation. Allen Green's on a 1-year deal right now. They have not extended him. And that just, to me, when you read the tea leaves, it looks to me like, okay, we're going to get Harsin out of here. Then we're going to have Allen Green gone within the next several months, and we're going to just start all over. But I just don't know if that's the wise thing to do right now, because you're going to look, this 2023 class for Auburn, to me, is not going to be salvageable, especially in state. If you make a coaching change, I know right now they're thinking, well, Bryan Harsin, isn't the answer. But if Bryan Harsin goes out there next year, if he can retool this roster, if you go 8-4, 9-3, and he can get some good players, it can turn quickly. Because with Gus Malzahn, it certainly did. He did it in the year one, but he actually had his first 2 or 3 years were really good before everybody kind of started figuring him out schematically. But again, like I said earlier in the conversation, his success was an outlier. Most of the time, Coach Dye included, you have to go through a year of transition. Gene Chizik, when he won a national championship in year 3, he had to go through it, a little bit of a transition before he got it rolling. And actually, it was year 2. But again, I just think overall, when you look at it, I think it's a panic move by Auburn to get rid of Bryan Harsin.
Well, putting the booster base aside for a moment, which you really can't do, and I'll return to that next. The order in which you mentioned something there was interesting. You talked about, we've talked about Harsin potentially being gone right now, but then Allen Green probably being gone in a few months. There you set yourself up for another bad situation, because don't you want your longer-term AD making your football hire? I mean, again, throw the boosters aside. We'll return to that, but that's another place where you just set yourself up to step in it down the line, potentially, it seems.
I totally agree. To me, if you're Auburn and you want to be smart, if you're the power brokers, you're the Jimmy Raines, you're on the board of trustees, you're an influential donor, what you got to do is, Allen Green's on a 1-year deal. You're leaning toward not bringing him back. You let him serve out his contract. You let Bryan Harsin come back for year 2. You see what adjustments he makes, getting his staff like he wants it, running the football program as he sees fit. If you see improvement that's good enough in year 2, and it looks like Allen Green may have made a solid hire, and that Bryan Harsin might be the answer to reestablishing the Auburn football program as an upper-level team in the SEC West, which means you're going to be in playoff conversation. Then you extend Allen Green, the AD, and you get behind Bryan Harsin. But see, to me, it's a no-lose situation. If Bryan Harsin comes out in the second year, if he goes 6-7 again, or whatever, or if he goes 5-7, doesn't go to a bowl game, then your decision's made. You don't bring Bryan Harsin back. You think he's a bad fit. It didn't work in 2 years, and you dismiss Allen Green. You go out and you hire an athletic director who then hires a football coach. I don't think you should get rid of the football coach, and then you have an AD who's basically going to be twisted in the wind for another year, as you said, Chris. How do you hire a football coach then? To me, you let this thing play out. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't panic, and you don't, start manufacturing bogus things like, verbal abuse of players. Trust me, I've been to some practices at Alabama. Nick Saban gets after it as well as anyone. You have to put it on HBO, okay? I mean, I know that the climate has changed, but you still got to coach these kids hard. They got to have discipline. I think a lot of this stuff is being overblown because there's a lot of people that are of influence in Auburn, Alabama that don't like Bryan Harsin. And again, I think he is a bad fit, but I still think any coach should get at least 2 years to prove his wares on the Power 5 level. It is nearly impossible to do, what Gus Malzahn did back in 2013. It's really, 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 really a rarity. Nick Saban didn't even do it. So I just think what's happening in Auburn is unfortunate right now. And I think if he's dismissed, it's a mistake. and I think it could hurt Auburn football for 3 to 5 years.
Well, to borrow a line from one of my favorite movies, which was The Insider, Al Pacino's character at the end of a situation where he's written a story on Big Tobacco or done a thing on 60 Minutes, and CBS basically cuts him off at the knees and he resigns, and he just, they're apologizing to him, stay on. And he said, I don't think we can undo what's been done here. And that's just how I see it. I don't know how. And look, this could be dated by the time we're done with it, right? But right. I don't know how you put that back in the box.
Well, I really don't either. If I'm Bryan Harsin and his representation, I certainly am going to dig in and try to get my money. And I think, that's why he did the interview with Chris Lowe. I think he's reading the tea leaves.
That's what I was thinking too, Drew. Yeah.
Yeah. He understands that there's people trying to cut him off at the knees and not support him. So you have to go on the defensive yourself. You have to put it out there, put out your core beliefs. You have to quell the rumors. And I think it's a smart thing to do. I personally, I'm in some group messaging where they didn't think it was smart of what Harsin did. I personally think it was, because I'm not going to let somebody run my character down, if that's not what's happening or not what's true. I mean, because they're trying to, in effect, ruin his career. Because if he's let go with this situation, I mean, it could really damage it, even if he gets, his buyout money. But they're trying to do that and not pay him, because they just paid Gus Malzahn $20 million to go away, because
Good
they
luck.
paid him a ludicrous extension. And that was from the previous Auburn administration. They gave him a contract that they probably shouldn't have. And so, because his program was, it was trending downward, but that was Auburn's mistake. So I think they're making another one for his, and let me laud them, first of all, for as good as they handled the Bruce Pearl and Louisville situation and got Bruce Pearl locked up as one of the top 4 highest paid coaches in college basketball. And they just approved a practice facility today that's going to be state-of-the-art as a standalone basketball facility, practice facility for Auburn hoops for the ladies and the men's programs, which would have been unheard of a decade ago. As well as they've handled the basketball situation, they get an F for football. This has not been handled well.
Well, look, if you're going to play one of the cards that was out there on social media this morning, you better darn well be sure that's sure, or Bryan Harsin might be getting more than $18 million not to coach.
Yeah, there could even be other, other messy lawsuits filed. So, which could really muddy the waters for Auburn football. To me, you just let the guy come back. You let him coach. If he doesn't win, then you have an out. With what happened with Chad Morris and what we've seen Sam Pittman do at Arkansas, which has been remarkable so far, there would be nobody raise an eyebrow if Bryan Harsin were dismissed after the second season. Okay? He just wasn't a good fit. Auburn decided to move on. But doing what they're doing now, it just really isn't a good look to me. I think they could do more harm than good to the football program. There are some around, they follow the Auburn program I truly respect that probably disagree with that, but I'm just giving you my take on things. I don't think, even with a coach that could be a bad fit, that you dismiss him after year one, especially just after National Signing Day, and you're really only a month from spring practice. That is really, really, really a tight timeline. And so, to me, you're treading on thin ice.
Well, and the other thing, and look, they may be totally justified in trying to get him out of. There's a lot of stuff I don't know, and things like this. There's only a few people that know the truth and don't. So nobody get upset at me for taking a side here. But the optics were. You look at their basketball success. He's right in the middle of that, promoting it, being out and interacting and doing the things that you'd want him to do if you're the school. In your proud moments. And so it's really weird against, the optics of that against this. That's another layer of complication. But look, it just seemed to me like this was never going to work with the booster base. Was it really something that he did or didn't do in his relationships with those people? Or was it just a case of the people who have control didn't have control, and it didn't matter who Bryan Harsin was or wasn't, and again, the 6-7 record's a big thing in this, right? Because if he goes 11-1, nobody cares. But how much of that is on Bryan Harsin, and how much of that is just people pissed off they didn't get their way?
I think it's more of the power brokers that didn't want him in the first place. I think Alan Green won a very public battle with a lot of the powers that be and some of the influential donors, because it was thought that Kevin Steele was going to get the job. And I think Alan Green wanted to control the search. He wanted to bring in and put a stamp on it himself and bring in his guy, because it's really a definition of his tenure. If he hits a home run with a football coach, it's going to be kind of like Tuberville. When Tuberville was not dismissed after Auburn, tried to go behind his back with Bobby Petrino, he came out and had his best years at Auburn and really ended up in a place of power for many years before the program split to the point where finally when he lost to Alabama in 2008, because he had a 6-game winning streak. And so there was, if you're beating Alabama, you're going to be the head football coach at Auburn. And he was in a place of power. But once Nick Saban came back to college football to Tuscaloosa, and once he turned the program really quick, he lost to Tuberville in year 1, but once he shut them out 36-0 in year 2, that all Tommy Tuberville's power eroded and he was done. Well, the same situation with Alan Green. If you hire Bryan Harsin, and you just mentioned 11-1, if Auburn had ended up in the college football playoff, Alan Green would already have a contract extension, and they would be talking about how Harsin's the new Saban. But, he won a power struggle to get Harsin. Harsin's first season, after that second half disaster against, Mississippi State, where everything went wrong, all of a sudden the Auburn Tigers lose 5 in a row. You lose to Alabama in just heartbreaking fashion when you control that game for over 59 minutes. And then your recruiting goes south. Your coaches are leaving, players are leaving. And there's a lot of rumors out there that some current players weren't helping Harsin and his staff recruit because they weren't recruited by Harsin and his staff, and there was some friction there. So it's just really a toxic situation. And I just think overall it goes down to the simple fact that I think there were some power brokers there at Auburn and people of influence that did not get their guy in Kevin Steele, and they've never supported Harsin, and he opened the door by losing. And so when he lost the 5 games in a row to end the season, when he didn't beat Alabama, that was all that some of these guys needed for the ammunition. And really, I think since the bowl game loss to Houston, this has been building and building and building. And once they just did not sign any players on National Signing Day, and you've been hearing the buzz of the 2023 class, and Auburn doesn't seem to have momentum, I just think it really rubs some Auburn fans and people of influence the wrong way. And I'll give you a perfect example. The Clemson Tigers, Dabo Swinney, he had a lot of turnover, as you know, for the first time on his staff, Chris. They came into the state of Alabama on the second signing day, and they signed Keelan Griffin of Montgomery Academy, a DB, T.J. Dudley, a linebacker Auburn would have loved to have had from Montgomery Catholic, and then Caden Story, whose brother's at Alabama, Christian Story. Caden Story had been committed to Auburn. He did not sign with Auburn early. The defensive line coach, Nick Eason, goes to Clemson. Caden Story follows him to Clemson, and Auburn loses out on 3 other targets and doesn't sign anybody this past Wednesday. And I think that in a lot of Auburn fans' minds and Auburn people of influence was the straw that broke the camel's back.
What is the fascination there with Kevin Steele?
I think that he's a guy that first of all, he put some really good Auburn defenses on the field for Gus Malzahn. But I think what he did, Kevin Steele ingratiated himself with the people of influence I just talked about. I think he realized Gus Malzahn didn't have a long shelf life. He realized his defense was the strength of the program. He was paid as one of the top 2 to 3 highest paid defensive coordinators in college football. And trust me, boosters pay that money. they gave him that contract, $2.5 million per year. And I think he ingratiated himself with the right people of influence. They liked him a lot. I think they felt like he could lead, he understood Auburn. He could lead that program. And I think behind closed doors, that's what I've heard. That by the end, he and Malzahn had no relationship because Malzahn didn't trust him, because I think Malzahn knew that Kevin Steele was after his job.
Yeah, that happens from time to time in college sports. But I want to shift some topics to some other college football things here before we end. But anything else on this situation with Auburn and Bryan Harsin that's maybe worth a mention that we didn't get into so far?
Not too much. I mean, I'll just say it would not surprise me. You even talked about us being dated by the time we get done here. I wouldn't be surprised by Sunday if there's been some sort of resolution to the situation. I know outgoing President Jay Goose, who's in his second tenure at Auburn, said today that they were trying to separate fact from fiction. And so it's going to be really interesting. I'm like you. I don't really know. I do think Harsin deserves a second year. I don't know how you move forward, though, with so much toxic things around it. I know some of his current players, like I told about, like I said, Wooten has come to his defense, Derek Hall, the edge rusher. You've got some prominent players coming to his defense. I just don't know if it's enough. But I will say this. I thought Tommy Tuberville was going to be dismissed. I firmly believe if he had lost the 2002 Iron Bowl to Alabama, where they were a heavy underdog, he would have been. He won. He got some public people behind him. He got a lot of momentum, and they kept him. Now, there's not a football game to be won or a recruit to get right now for Auburn to get some momentum for Harsin. But if some of his players come to his defense and they're able to turn this thing around, from a perception standpoint, maybe he holds on to the job. But my prediction right now would be that by the end of the weekend, or early next week, we may have a change at Auburn. That's just my gut. I don't know how Bryan Harsin can survive this, or why he would even want to stay when so many people that he needs support from don't want him there.
Well, one other footnote, and maybe it wouldn't matter anyway, given all the layers we've talked about, but I always look at schedules before the season and try to go in my mind, okay, where could this go wrong? Because there's always something that happens out of the blue now. And there's only, the sum of all teams' records in the SEC is going to be 500. And I'd say there's about 11 teams in this league that want to win really, really badly, probably more like 13. Missouri and Kentucky, it's not maybe quite as white-hot as the rest of the league. Kentucky because of football, but maybe they're getting there. And I guess you could probably argue Missouri too. And then there's Vandy, which is kind of its own animal. But somebody's always going to be displeased. And look at what Bryan Harsin walked into, right? You get Penn State in your out-of-conference schedule, on the road nonetheless. You get Georgia out of the East. You get your West schedule at a time when literally every single team in the division went to a bowl. You get South Carolina on your other East game, which, at the beginning of the season, that and Vandy would have been one of the two you wanted. Well, South Carolina got better, and maybe more importantly, when it comes to late season football, was still interested in being out there. And then you got in the Birmingham Bowl, you could have certainly caught a better break than getting Houston. He didn't catch a lot of breaks along the way in the scheduling either.
No, he did not. It was a difficult schedule, no doubt about it. And I know he had Georgia and Alabama at home, but Georgia and Alabama were the two best teams in the country. And, so that was going to be a tough situation for him. Penn State, they played a hard football game. They nearly won that game. I thought they represented themselves well. The one that just was a disaster was certainly because they beat a good Ole Miss team. They beat a good Arkansas team on the road, by the way, winning in Fayetteville. I thought it was their best win of the year. But they fell flat against Mississippi State. They did not look like they were interested in playing against Texas A&M. They got physically whipped. But I still think a lot of that is because there were some players, and we've heard from them today, like a Smoke Monday, like and they've had some other kids transfer out, like a Lee Hunter, the defensive tackle. You're seeing some of the malcontents also put some things out there on social media, so which doesn't help the situation. But I just think overall it was a very difficult first year for Bryan Harsin. I think he deserves a second year. I just don't know that there will be one. And then that opens up a whole nother can of worms with, is Kevin Steele finally going to get this job, or who would possibly take it during a time frame where recruiting has just ended? The transfer portal situation, will be ongoing until May the 1st. But and again, I think Bryan Harsin and staff would have added some more pieces there. But the new coach will certainly have to, because I think if you dismiss Bryan Harsin, there could be other guys like a Derek Hall, like some of these veterans that are speaking up, a Colby Wooten, that might end up testing the transfer portal too, which could set Auburn football back even further. So it's just not a good situation right now. I feel for Bryan Harsin and his family. I feel for some of the Auburn fans, because I know they want to be good, but right now it's a struggle.
All right, let's back out of Auburn for a minute and just look at the college football landscape. I mean, it was just amusing at times watching the perception war between Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban and all the NIL stuff. You've heard Kirby Smart has even come out and kind of sounded the alarm against some of this stuff. What's your general reaction? What's going on with NIL? With Jimbo Fisher's lashing out. I mean, it's been quite a week, Auburn stuff aside.
Well, I just think NIL, you're going to have Congress and the NCAA be proactive, which I know that's like an anomaly, but you're going to have them step in and regulate this stuff. Because I've got people in recruiting in the business that have come to me and told me it's just getting crazy already. I mean, I know it hasn't been around that long, but and Nick Saban kind of sounded the alarm. He really is one of the most prominent voices in college football, and he's always on top of situations and knows about the issues in the game, and I think does a great job of alerting people. I've been told that Alabama has fallen a little behind on NIL. They were trying to get a grip on it. They wanted to be at the forefront of it, but it's taken them, several months to get an idea of how it works right now. And everyone's trying to combat Texas A&M, who is the most aggressive with it, because let's be honest, I know there's those reports out there of $30 million slush funds and things of that nature. I don't think that's the case, and Jimbo Fisher was very adamant about that. But I do know this. I do think a lot of the success of Texas A&M has been NIL-based, because if you look at Jimbo Fisher's history as a recruiter, he's a good one, not a great one. I mean, they just signed more 5-stars in one class than Jimbo had done the previous 3 years. And Jimbo had recruited well at Texas A&M. But this class is on another level, and I think it's because of Texas A&M's plan and what they did, systematically approaching NIL. You give them credit. They got the right donors to step up. But what they're doing, and it's what Nick Saban talked about yesterday, or a couple of days ago actually now, and it's one of those situations where Nick Saban didn't call them out by name, but that's who he was talking about. Texas A&M is using NIL to entice recruits. You're only supposed to talk NIL when you get on campus. But what they're doing, they're putting together multi-year deals, some even with vacations included, if the rumors are true, that are getting these kids to sign with Texas A&M. And that's what it's based on. I mean, they do have great facilities there. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on them. But let's not misunderstand something, Chris. The indignant response of Jimbo Fisher reminded me of Hugh Freeze in 2013, when Hugh Freeze was when they were recruiting on a level we've never seen at Ole Miss. And I nicknamed it on my show, Growing Up Wanting to Be a Rebel. I was like, wide receivers from Chicago, Illinois, grow up their whole lives, Laquan Treadwell, 5-star guy, wanting to be an Ole Miss Rebel, a program that had never won an SEC West championship, has not won an SEC title since the days of John Vaught back in the 1960s. They have not, won a title in that long, and yet they're recruiting top 5 classes. It's one of those things, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so you just kind of felt like something was, and this was pre-NIL, of course, but you just knew that something was amiss, that Ole Miss was doing some things that were not legal. And right now it's a gray area, and technically it hasn't been regulated, so I guess it is legal. But it's the same kind of situation with Texas A&M. There's some things NIL-wise that they're doing because they just signed 4 of the top 5 defensive linemen in the country. And only maybe 1 or 2 of those guys are from their geographic recruiting area. Walter Nolan had been to 3 high schools. He was in Powell High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. I mean, are you kidding me? And all of a sudden you're telling me he grew up his whole life wanting to be a Texas A&M Aggie, a program that just lost 4 games. I know they beat Alabama, but they lost 4 games. They weren't even a contender. And you're telling me that Shamar Stewart from Miami, Florida, with, Mario Cristobal now there, with, Billy Napier now. I mean, of course, the instability there probably helped, but Shamar Stewart grew up wanting to be an Aggie. I mean, come on. It was a good year in state in Texas, especially in the Houston area, and A&M got a lot of those guys, and you understand it. But they were recruiting nationally, and when you look at Texas A&M's brand, while they do have great facilities, the bottom line is, what is your tradition? Are you a winning program? And there are 2 programs in the SEC West historically that have never been to Atlanta: Ole Miss and Texas A&M. And that's all I can tell you. That's why NIL needs to be regulated. Certainly, I'm for the players getting paid a certain amount. I don't really know if I agree with this $1 million stuff when you hardly ever played. Like even Bryce Young had never played a snap until this year. Certainly, he lived up to it. I think it's a dangerous slope, though, to be paying guys like that. But again, I just think that one of the biggest issues in college football going forward is getting NIL under control.
But here's a counterpoint, Drew. These guys were not playing for free before. They weren't playing for free since before we were born. Is the gripe just that somebody else has done it better? I mean, it seems to me like it's a lot of what was going on before. Is it just that it's been taken to a power? Is it that the gentleman's agreements don't come into play anymore? I mean, what is it that's really pissing people off? Because I don't think these kids, all of them that were elite, were going just for the cost of education before.
No, I mean, and even Jimbo Fisher admitted himself. He said, "Well, we're able to do things now legally that weren't legal years ago." And I think what's irritating some people is it was Lane Kiffin he called out Texas A&M himself. He said, they almost need a salary cap for how much they're offering because there are certain schools, booster bases, and power brokers that will spend more money than others. Because the endowment of Texas A&M is in the billions. They've got a lot of rich alums that will step up NIL-wise. I think Alabama is going to be going to some of their prominent boosters and getting them to pony up for NIL. We've already seen Ty Washington drive to a Kentucky practice. Was it a Porsche? I can't remember. I just know he had a sports car. And so
yeah, I think it was another player, but I saw that too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a prominent Kentucky basketball. That may have been Shaden Sharp, and he's not even playing. So I mean,
it was. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, but again, I just think overall, it's what's pissing some people off is certain schools having a monetary advantage over others. In other words, they want a regulated system where there's kind of a tier where you don't have to worry about, okay, we're recruiting this kid, and then all of a sudden school X comes in and offers him $300,000 more than we can ever touch, and then that's the decision-making process. They want it to be a more level playing field. I mean, and as you said, Chris, there's always been some gray areas in recruiting, but I think when you start talking this kind of money, it's almost like free agency. That's what Lane Kiffin called it. But I will say this, it's not going away. you have to deal with it. And so these coaching staffs are going to have to deal with it. And certainly, Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC, and the power brokers in college football are going to have to deal with it. And likely, as much as I hate it, Congress. So it's going to be one of those things where it'll be dealt with nationally, at some point in time. Because, again, right now it's the wild, wild west. And to Texas A&M's credit, I mean, I certainly don't like it, covering the University of Alabama, wanting them to do well, wanting Auburn to do well. But you got to give A&M credit. They found the loophole in the system, and until they change it, they're going to continue to exploit it.
Yeah, I had a laugh this week at the suggestion of Congress fixing it. That might be the one institution that's more inept than the NCAA. But
right.
I mean, where do you think? How does this realistically get fixed? Here's my take on the whole thing. Right, I think between the portal, NIL, all these things that have just thrown everything into chaos, and frankly, I think ruining a lot of the fun of it. I never had an idealized version of college football in the first place, but things can always get worse by degrees, and I think that's kind of where we are. But it feels to me like this is just sort of a necessary evil of 2 or 3 years. It's like when we went through the financial crisis of 2008 or whenever it was. You got to let time run its course, let the chickens, come home to roost, so to speak, and then in the end, once you go through all those messes, things start to calm down and settle down. I don't know how this ends up looking, but to me, it's kind of the NCAA has held this and really invited this moment with its years of stupidity with putting Ohio State on probation because a guy got a tattoo or whatever else. I mean, we can all cite 1,000 examples, but the point is between that and the transfer rule, which really people started to have a problem with, and I think this was fair, when you saw coaches leave kids high and dry, and they can cut out of a 10-year contract at any point, whereas a kid, couldn't just leave a school without penalty. There were so many inconsistencies and just violations of common sense and decency for so many years. The NCAA invited this problem, and now the dam burst, and it's kind of funny to me to watch them have to deal with it. But I really think it's going to take a few years of a mess, but it's a necessary mess to get this straightened out.
It is, and the NCAA, it is mostly their fault. They have sat on their hands for too long. They've exploited the kids too long. This is where I agree with Jay Billis, in many ways, because these kids, for many, 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 many years, college athletics has been a big money business. And once about in the mid-'90s, when Nike kind of rose to prominence, and what I mean by that, started being an outfitter for schools, they started putting out collegiate, memorabilia for you to buy at your local store. When they start putting out jerseys with numbers on them for the public to buy, you knew this was going to happen because these kids are making millions of dollars for these schools. And, they're not getting a cut of it. It's why I know you probably remember several years ago during Nick Saban's tenure, probably around the time he won the back-to-back titles in 11 and 12, the T-Town menswear situation, which was the autographs. Now that's legal. It was not legal at that point in time. Personally, I had this take on it. Hey, look, Trent Richardson or whoever's involved, A.J. McCarron, I know his stuff was, in Windows. Hey, here's what I say. These dudes are bringing millions of dollars into this university. They are bringing fans into the stands. It goes back to what Coach Bryant said many years ago. He was quoted as saying, it's kind of hard to rally around a math class. No disrespect, but, I mean, the people are coming 70, 80, 90,000, 100,000 people to see the football team and the football program. This is the way I equated it. If these dudes signed autographs and got paid under the table, then, hey, just everybody be quiet. Don't say a word. Go about your business. Because guess what? These dudes were making a lot of money off their blood, sweat, and tears to bring money. And guess what it does? This is what I've always said. Football and athletics in SEC schools, they grow the academic side because they attract students. They attract donors. They attract people that want to come to your school. And so to me, guys being compensated, I've never had a problem with it. I mean, I understand NIL is getting kind of crazy, and the sums of money are astronomical, and that's why I think there needs to be some sort of regulation and some sort of system put in place. But I have no problem whatsoever for these guys being paid, because basically collegiate athletics is a big money business. These coaches are making now, can you believe this? Gene Stallings, when he retired from Alabama in 97, or at the end of the 96 season, I think the most money he ever made, Chris, was $750,000. Now a running backs coach makes that.
Yeah.
I mean, the head coaches make $10 million a year. So they're making tens of millions of dollars. So the players getting a cut of this, I have no problem with.
Well, it's funny to see these guys making more than the coaches and the presidents of the universities, but that's what free market economies do. And here's the other issue with that, and this is sort of a tangent. People say, well, the schools should pay players the money and all that stuff. You got Title IX to deal with, so I don't know how you can ever really do that if your schools, from a regulatory standpoint, because then you gotta pay women's lacrosse the same as a quarterback gets paid, and I don't know how you ever do that without the market system and the outside forces that are involved in this now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, no doubt about it. I mean, it's the way the game has changed just in 5 years is stunning. I mean, and I still remember when Ed O'Bannon started kind of bringing this to light.
Yeah, gosh, that seems like it's 3 centuries ago. Yeah,
I know, and I can remember watching Ed O'Bannon, win a national championship with his brother at UCLA, and for Jim Herrick. So that's what's so mind-numbing. But it's changed so much, and again, I think a lot of it is positive. Now, there's going to be several people that think a lot, or a majority, or I don't know, that a lot. There's going to be a segment of people that don't like it because they think it's ruining the integrity. But it's kind of like what you said. For many years, this has gone on under the table. It's just like the funny stories that Eric Dickerson tells now about a gold Trans Am that he was given by Texas A&M, and yet he never went to school there. Okay? So, I mean, this stuff has been going on for many years, just under the table. Now it's more out in the public light, but it just needs to be regulated. And again, now you have the SEC network, the ACC network, the Pac-12 network, Big Ten network. You've got so much money being pumped into collegiate athletics, it's not going to stop. It's what you just talked about, a free market society and a free market economy. So certainly these colleges and universities understand if they build facilities, if they hire the right coaches. I mean, think about this. The University of Alabama, I think their enrollment now is 46,000. I mean, the university, since Nick Saban, is doubled in size since he came to Alabama, and a lot of it is absolutely because of him. And I remember when he was hired in 2007, it was an absolute they were just people just incredulous that he was making over nearly $4 million a year. Now, Mark Stoops makes that. I mean, it's just something that's stunning. It's crazy. And you would know this. You covered Vanderbilt, for your career. I was even told, and Vandy's a private school, they don't release this kind of information, that when James Franklin had his run at Vandy, when they had a couple of 9-win seasons in a row, by the time he left for Penn State, I was told he was making $3 to $4 million a year. Now, I don't know if that's true because they never released his salary, but he was making more than any Vandy coach ever has. Am I correct?
It wouldn't surprise me. I know for a fact that he had been made an offer of 10 years and $50 million to stay there, which doesn't seem like much now, but in 2013, that was, that's everybody's eyebrows get raised over that type of money.
And that just shows you right there. And Vandy has never really taken football as seriously as other schools. And yet they have rich alums just like everybody else. The panache and the value of a Vandy education is astronomical. They put together an offer of 10 years and $50 million. That just goes to show you if you get the right guy in place, especially at any school in the SEC, it's going to mean just huge boosts financially. And so, again, I just think it's fascinating, and I'm going to be really anxious to see how the landscape continues to change in college football. I still think the SEC is going to absolutely dominate this thing because I just think Greg Sankey. I personally I've admired what he's done. He won me over with the way he handled the COVID situation and the way he's handled some very difficult issues in the last couple of years. I think he's the best commissioner in collegiate athletics.
Well, and here's another thing, okay? You have seen the league start to invest so much in other areas, and here's one thing. You and I are both big baseball fans. The league and its teams have figured out, hey, there's a rabid market for this over there too, to where even the teams that lag the field in baseball, other than maybe Missouri, and correct me if I'm wrong, Missouri may have made some investments too. The investments you're seeing in these other sports now, softball, not one that I follow, but you can't help but notice. I don't know how much of that goes to Greg Sankey or where the credit goes, but you're seeing the league make investments in these sports and be a little step ahead of the curve of everybody else and figure out, hey, there's value over in these other areas too, basketball, baseball, softball, whatever, to where now you're seeing the league. I mean, it's always been good in baseball. You can argue this year it's going to be as good as it's ever been, if not better. Softball, it dominates. Basketball, that's been the story of the year, right? The SEC's emergence in basketball, and debatably the best two teams are in this league. I think that's where, I don't know if it's Greg Sankey or somebody else, but seems like somebody there deserves some credit for that too.
I think Greg Sankey deserves a lot of credit. He put an emphasis on basketball 5-6 years ago. He put out a mandate. He wanted the best coaches hired. He employed some people as consultants that helped them improved everybody's scheduling model, and get the SEC Big 12 Challenge in January, where it's a showcase for the selection committee, so to speak. And I think you could argue this year that the SEC men's basketball is the best in the country, no doubt. I mean, the women's basketball has always been strong. I think it's a little bit more top-heavy now, but the entire sport of women's basketball is top-heavy. But you've got Dawn Staley. You have now Tennessee post-Pat. It was just horrific to lose Pat Summitt so early. But I think Tennessee is finally getting back on that track of being a prominent program again, which will be good for. And then, to me, I know you just talked about baseball. Yes, they've been the preeminent baseball league for many, many years. But can you imagine, Chris, in just by 2025, when you add Oklahoma and Texas to this baseball league? I mean, are you kidding me? You could have routinely 12 teams in the top 25. Half of the top 25 could be from the SEC. I mean, I really believe that because of how they've invested in stadiums, how they've invested in resources for baseball. My only thing is that I don't know if, again, Greg Sankey is trying to help with it, and I really applaud him for this. He's trying to expand coaching staffs for baseball, get more paid on-field assistants, and the real thing they've got to do is, I don't know if it'll ever happen, I wish they could do something about the 11.7 scholarships. I know that other states have, different rules with their lotteries and stuff where they can get around it. I just think more scholarships need to be given to baseball because of how good the product is. And I'll say this, I got to give credit to Greg Sankey and the powers that be too, because 15 years ago, it would have been unheard of to think that the Pac-12 didn't dominate softball, but they don't anymore. Far and away, the SEC is the best softball league in America. I know Oklahoma won the national championship last year, but again, the SEC is the deepest league by far, and it is. And there's even rumors that Vanderbilt may finally join in on the fray with that. And trust me,
I think they will.
Builds a stadium, and if they invest in it, with the education that you can get at Vanderbilt University, I really don't think it'll take that long because we've seen Clemson and Duke already become very good at it. I think there'll be a time in the very near future where the SEC will have 14 teams. Every team, well, now 16, because Oklahoma is the best program in the country, arguably, right now. They're coming to the SEC, and then you're going to get Texas. Let me amend that. 16 SEC softball teams in the NCAA tournament, all of them.
Crazy. One little thing that you said, I wonder about baseball, and I wonder if, the SEC is just it's brutal in baseball, and I don't know if it's going to make Texas stronger or it's going to bring them down to the middle of the pack. I mean, as we sit here, Texas is most people's number one team for 2022. And then with Oklahoma, I think the investment in the facilities, I don't think has been there. I worry for Oklahoma that what could happen to Oklahoma would be what happened to Missouri, where Missouri was a pretty good program. Aaron Crow, Max Scherzer, guys like that. And you saw that program was pretty regularly going to NCAA tournaments. They join the SEC and they fall off into the abyss. Got it close a couple years ago of getting into the tournament. I thought should have. But I do wonder on both those ends, what happens to Texas, and does Oklahoma, does it benefit and get with it, and the SEC makes it stronger because it's a more attractive recruiting base, or does it get crushed the way that Missouri did?
Well, I would be more concerned about OU. I would agree with you there. They've been a little up and down. No doubt about it. I think when you look at it, they were a power in the 90s. They won it all in 1994 with Chip Glass being MVP for the Sooners. But since that period of time, they've been, I would say inconsistent. I would worry about their long-term viability, but I wouldn't worry about Texas. I think Texas has got more money than anybody, and then when they come into the SEC, they still will. I think they understand what they'll have to do to win. It's not going to be as easy because the Big 12 is not as deep a league as the SEC, but I think the baseball people at Texas will understand that. Now, I don't know if they'll ever get out of their own way long enough in football because they've got a lot of people that meddle in that program. I do think Chris Beard is an outstanding basketball coach. I think he will help enhance the SEC in basketball. I think Porter Mosier, Oklahoma-wise, I think he's an outstanding coach. I think Oklahoma basketball will do just fine. Will be an NCAA-level program. I do worry about Oklahoma baseball, but we'll see. It's just going to depend on if they want to step up and commit. Oklahoma football, to me, is kind of interesting because they've made the college football playoff in the Big 12 and dominated that league, but the SEC is going to be a different animal. And Lincoln Riley seemed to question some commitment. That's why he left. He didn't want any part of the SEC. He decided to go to the West Coast and go to USC. So Oklahoma as an entire athletic department is really going to fascinate me with how they attack the Southeastern Conference. I do think Texas has got the deepest pockets there is. And I think, honestly, Texas would never admit this, but I think they're in priority. I think for them, football is number one, and they're going to have to finally row the boat in the same direction if they ever want to get to the top of the league. But I think baseball may be a close number two. I think even over basketball. I think when you look at Cliff Gustafson and Augie Garrido and the history of that baseball program, it's a rich one, and I think they take it very, very seriously. And I think Texas, baseball-wise, and this is saying a lot, will be one of the top 4 to 5 programs in the SEC because when you've got Vanderbilt, which may be the best program in America, you've got LSU, who always takes baseball very seriously. You've got the defending national champion Mississippi State Bulldogs. You've got, the Ole Miss Rebels, who have had unprecedented success, during their last 15 to 16 year run. I mean, there's just so many really good programs. I mean, Alabama used to be a great program, and Coach Bohannon's trying to get it back, but the league is so deep it's hard to get traction because there's so many great programs. But I certainly think bringing the Texas brand into SEC baseball is going to do nothing but strengthen what could end up being a 16-team league in baseball, where you could compete with Double-A leagues in the minor leagues with the talent that's there.
Yeah, I've said for a while the SEC tournament may be tougher to win than the College World Series.
I would agree with that completely.
As crazy as it sounds. Drew, I know from this podcast, from sitting next to you at SEC tournaments and just talking to you on the phone, I'm pretty sure as we sit here at 2:54 on a Friday afternoon, you and I could probably talk till midnight on SEC sports. Maybe one day if we've got nothing else to do, we'll have that 8-hour podcast. But I'm going to let you go. Tell folks where they can find you on Twitter, where they can find your show. You guys do a phenomenal job down there in Huntsville. Always enjoy being on your show. And tell people where they can find you, because you are definitely worth a listen.
Well, I really appreciate that. I've enjoyed this. I mean, time flies when you're talking sports and having fun. And again, I've been doing this for 6+ years, and I was, for a short time, I was a beat writer covering Alabama. Before that, I was in sporting goods sales, but I always had a passion. I just didn't realize for a while that I had enough gift for gab to talk on the radio, but it's the only job I've ever loved. I've enjoyed getting to know people like yourself and make connections in the business, and that I'm just honored that people, value my opinion and like to listen to, our show. And we bring you Talking Ball 7 to 9 a.m. Monday through Friday in the Rocket City of Huntsville on ESPN 97.7 The Zone. And if you don't want to catch our stuff, if you miss our show, we podcast everything on 977ESPN.com. You can connect with me on Twitter at DrewD977ESPN. I don't mind the conversation. I don't mind questions. I love the interaction. And, of course, you can connect with our station at 977 ESPN. And we certainly enjoy featuring you and Blake Lovell to talk, we talk Vandy with you some, and, of course, Southeastern 14, which is growing by leaps and bounds. And we're just very excited to continue to feature both of you guys on our airwaves. We get a lot of positive feedback from our listeners, and we just appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk some sports with you today and talk some SEC, because it's never boring.
Hey, as the kids say, let's run it back soon.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you.
All right, he's Drew DeArmond. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for listening. Back with more content here soon at the 14.